Hi everyone, so welcome back. We have another video that we're going to look at today that critiques religion or the idea of God or religion. This is Christopher Hitchens. I don't think he needs much of an introduction. One of the probably most eloquent and formidable opponents of religion was one of what they call the four horsemen of atheism and had just a certain way with words. So we'll take a look at his video. Again, it's one that I've had sent to me quite a lot, so I want to look at it together and talk about it.
100,000 years our species has been around on this speck, born, usually dying, actually a great number of them in childbirth, wouldn't have got beyond being born. Terrible struggle, sacrifice, pain, misery, and above all fear and ignorance. And you have to believe this if you believe in monotheism. For the first 97, 98,000 of this, heaven watches with indifference. Oh, there they go again.
Now, the first thing I'm just going to point out over here, again, I think it's an obvious point. We need to make sure when these debates take place, and this works on both sides, that we're not straw manning. And straw man means you create a position that you're going to attack that isn't the position that people hold. The classical position of monotheistic thinkers is God is not in space and time, but an atemporal being, which means he isn't sitting inside watching, what's going on? Oh, yeah, there they go again. The whole thing is probably a single instant from that perspective. We can't get our heads around what that perspective would be, but obviously if there is a creator of space and time, it's not sitting waiting. It might have, as it creates the world, a point by which something should happen and is allowing another point for it not to happen, and that might be valid, but there's just the model being created here is not necessarily an accurate one, but let's let him develop that now.
3,000 years ago at the most, it's decided, no, we've got to intervene now.
Okay, so that's my point. Of course, this would be an inaccurate portrayal, but there is still a relevant point. What's so special about 3,000 years ago? Why then and not earlier? Right, that's the real key point that he's making. But again, now let's watch how he develops the critique of this idea that it'll be 3,000 years ago.
You have to believe it. You have to believe it, and the revelation must be personal, must appear. So we'll pick the most backward, the most barbaric, the most illiterate, the most superstitious, and the most savage people we can find in the most stony area of the world.
I presume he's referring to the ancient Israelites in the Sinai desert over here. I'm not sure why I would say they're the most barbaric and savage people he could find, but I think what he means is it wasn't, surely you would have expected it to be, as he'll soon say, ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt or China, Indus Valley civilization, which are very sophisticated. Why take a bunch of liberated slaves? I presume that's the point he's trying to make rather than something about their barbarism.
We won't appear to the Chinese, who can already read.
Now, this point is actually incredibly important. You see, if we think about the model of history, and again, when you date humans, modern humans from, is so up for, it just depends on definitions. Most humans lived as hunter-gatherers as far as we can tell, and then eventually as farmers. The movement into cities, by which we mean not just population agglomerates like Shatal Hayuk and Jericho in the Neolithic Revolution, but proper cities which have social complexity, classes, higher classes, lower classes, organized humanity, written word, these sorts of things which then create modern humanity as we know it to this day, happened about 5,500 years ago, roughly. Starting in Mesopotamia, starting in Egypt, and then either spreading or spontaneously emerging simultaneously in the Indus Valley and then in China. It's there that we begin the mass oppression of humans by humans. It's there that we get this organized sense of you belong to a lower class, which then becomes groups that then expand their empire and their territory under their control other groups, the Akkadian Empire and this empire and that empire, that start to really then systematically oppress and abuse others. That happens starting from around 5,500 years ago, not in all the time before then. It's there the Torah enters the world. 3,300 years ago, by our tradition, he's going to use the number 3,000 at the earliest, that's where it enters the world. So it's a very important point in history to enter the world with. And I think it's actually incredibly important that it doesn't enter into those civilizations where they have this mass sense of hierarchy. Where they say they were literate, what that really means is the tiny elites were literate. Writing was so complex in those civilizations that only small numbers of people could possibly read or write, which meant only small numbers of people could possibly control all the masses. Right? I think that's exactly would have been the most terrible people to take a Torah whose massive thesis is You slave people became free. We're not going to build a world based on human oppressing human. Now, there might be details in the Torah which we question on this, but the principle fundamentally is that nobody, no human, can just oppress a human. Priests who in other parts of the world controlled the writing, controlled the land, controlled everything, in Torah are going to be told you can't. You can't control it. You don't even own any land. Kings who were the ultimate authority, sometimes divine, are told actually you don't even need one. And if you want to appoint one, make sure they don't have too much wealth, make sure they don't have too much luxury, and make sure they're subject to the courts and to the law, which is supreme, the same law that applies to every citizen. The rich people, your land has to be redistributed every 50 years. So it's a very anti-power model of a civilization that it's going to build. And that's something you wouldn't give to those people who had created the very autocratic, or not necessarily autocratic, but hierarchical world. And again, I'm not trying to criticize the ancient world, but that's exactly what the Torah is fighting against. The hierarchies who could read or write. They were the problem, not the solution in this sense. They did other wonderful things for the world, but not their moral and social values at all. That's what God would want a rebellion against.
We won't appear in the Indus Valley where they know a thing or two and they're already, they're very far advanced. No. We'll appear to this brutal, enslaved, hopeless, superstitious crowd, and we'll force them to cut their way through all of their neighbors with slaughter, genocide and racism, and settle on the only part of the Middle East where there's no oil.
So let me come back to one or two bits. So obviously he's referring to the fact they then have big battles in the entry into Canaan, and it's described biblically as they should not let anyone live. It is important to note. I'm certainly talking the traditional Jewish understanding of this, going back thousands of years, not modern apologetics over here, that they actually were to instruct the locals that we're entering with this new covenant, this new model of civilization. You don't need to change your ways, but the 7 fundamental moral principles, the idea of monotheism, the idea of, in particular, that equal law applying to every citizen, the idea that you can't kill, in particular, children, which was done a lot in the ancient world, but everything else, the language, the culture, the civilization, the holidays, the things you do, the rituals, the laws you live under, as long as they're expanded equally to everyone, you could keep. If not, then there's a new law in the land, you can leave, and if not, then there's a civil war. And that civil war did happen. The Bible does talk about very fierce wars and destruction of cities, which were tiny places in the ancient world. They weren't very big, but they controlled everything. So the Israelites and the Canaanites would fight over the cities. The Israelites would destroy the city, and at that point, there'd be no more control. They didn't take them out anywhere else, it seems. So yes, in the ancient world, they didn't have a way of distinguishing soldiers and civilians. There was some, and the Bible tells us that's one-off. You can't do that again, can't replicate it again in history. So that is something which people could grapple with and be bothered by, but it wasn't racism. On the contrary, it's about values. If they change the values, they can keep, they don't have to adopt the whole biblical law. They don't have to become citizens of Israel per se, but they do have to accept certain basic moral principles and reject certain ways of being. In particular, the idea of hierarchical injustice, and in particular, the idea of killing children would have been the most common application of that. Okay, but that's a small detail. It's an important one in the basic point. The oil in the Middle East, I think, is a modern joke. I don't think he meant that as some critique of God. But let's just see how he then goes on.
And all subsequent revelations occur in the same district. And without this, we wouldn't know right from wrong.
The idea that all subsequent revelations occur in the same district actually makes a lot of sense, because this little place on earth where these values are concentrated is going to impact its neighbors more than anywhere else. And others will come along feeling inspired. In some ways they'll obviously believe they're real inspirations. We as observant Jews would cast doubt upon that. But it doesn't matter. The principles are going to spread out from there to the rest of the world. The idea that gladiatorial combat is a terrible thing might have needed Christianity to spread it into the Roman Empire. The idea that infanticide has to be eliminated benefited enormously from spreads of Christianity and Islam and other vehicles that took the ideas out of the Middle East into the conversation of humanity. Many of these ideas may have taken centuries and centuries to be manifest. Some of their full visions might have needed technology to make them possible. The full idea of humans not controlling humans might have needed to wait till industrialization, when machines could replace human labor, but the principles had been embedded. The idea of giving them at that particular time, I think, actually is the following, and this is an argument he doesn't make fully here, but it's made elsewhere by others. A.C. Grayling makes it and others make it, is why not wait a little bit longer and wait till there's cameras who could record it? And of course the answer is cameras couldn't have recorded anything. If an infinite creator is speaking to the people, you hear it directly in your brain, you wouldn't see or record anything, and if you would, you'd probably say it's some kind of sleight of the camera. But the most important recording device of all had just entered humanity, and that was the alphabet. Just before that point in history, writing was, as I said, that was part of hierarchical control. It was incredibly complex. Think of hieroglyphics. You had to be basically born into the priestly class. The average peasant or farmer could never learn to read or write. They had to trust the authority of the people who had all the power and could tell them what the teachings said. It seems about 3,500 years ago, in some mines in the Sinai desert, that rocky area he referred to, no oil area, somebody starts writing in what we now call the alphabet. That is, they took somewhere between 20 and 30 symbols that each symbolizes a consonant and allows every word you might ever want to say to be recorded in a simple device that every 3-year-old kid can learn. The alphabet revolutionizes the world because it democratizes knowledge. It creates the possibility that every single person, rich or poor, can read what the law is and hold people accountable. And when that alphabet enters, straight afterwards, the slave people who've been slaves to what was the world's superpower, most organized and technologically, scientifically advanced group in the world, ancient Egypt, and the people oppressed by them come through that desert where probably they themselves had learnt to read or write, or may well have done, or certainly could very easily, and receive an alphabetic message. A message that says, power is no longer the way. God as sovereign means all in the image of God. All of us have value. There may need to be full-time employees. Before industrialization, there may need to be some kind of sense of servitude as well, but it cannot be done in an oppressive way. It has to be done in a way that's valuing people and striving towards a world of equal value for everybody. That cannot be given unless there's a recording device that allows every citizen, not just the elites, to read it and to understand it. That moment in history where the revolution is ripe, you people who've been slaves, you people who've tasted what's right about the world, science and technology, but what's wrong about the world, hierarchy and oppression and divination of making humans divine, making ancient ancestors of humans divine, which meant that humans could then justify killing each other just like ancestors had killed each other. All of that stuff is wrong. And the world's perfect moment for that is not long after civilization's begun, when a slave group has moved out and moved, yes, into a rocky place that is not civilized, and given a message that each one of them for the next few thousand years, with a perfect device, can read and say, this is God's idea. You humans who oppress us don't have a right to do so.
And without this, we wouldn't know right from wrong.
Well, I think, yes, without this, we might know some right from wrong. Some right from wrong is deeply instinctive. Some right from wrong can be exhibited in animals, certain social behavior and social fabric. A meerkat will risk its life standing on a perch to protect the others and so on. But in the animal kingdom, it's quite restricted. You look after your tribe, you kill the next one. Or, early humans, we know how they developed. Infanticide is a great example of something that was very widespread, very practiced. We own the children, we decide if they live or die. And this is not just thugs or uncivilized. We're talking Aristotle writes this in Politics, Book 7, that the ideal is that no maimed or imperfect children be raised, no disabled children, and if too many are born that year, rather than work harder to support them, limits must be placed on the population of the state. We're not criticizing ancients, they did incredible things. But yes, we wouldn't know right from wrong. You could have the brilliance of Greece and Rome, the ingenuity and advancement of these, and we could have then advanced into the modern era and not necessarily changed our values. These texts did revolutionize the way humans think about these things and universalize these values and think about the application of them. So in summary, the moral revolution and the values revolution and the change in the dreams of civilization that this Torah brought to the world. And I'm not going through now every single possible critique of it. Of course, there's things that might disturb people, and maybe we'll talk about them in other videos. But the principle, the radical revolutions with their vision of a world where everyone's at peace with one another, these were new narratives in humanity, and they were best delivered into a world of the unsophisticated, of those who weren't living in those hierarchical societies, in a text that could be spread so that every child could read it and challenge. And it's thank God for that little slave group in the middle of that barren place where the alphabet had emerged, that managed to create values that allowed the further advances of civilization and science and technology to be accompanied by a set of values that are today quite universal and have changed the world.